Welcome to Breaking Bread, the podcast brought to you by Apostolic Christian Counseling and Family Services. Ted Witzig Jr. is with me today. Hi, Ted.
Hi, Matt.
Ted, I have heard you say that if you were given a chance to share out something to the church from your experience as a clinician, that one of those primary topics would be how one sheds hurt. Did I hear you right?
That is correct. As far as skills go, there's no question that dealing with hurt and moving on from it is one of those things that everybody has to learn how to do, but very, very few people know how to do it well.
Right there's a great deal of optimism, okay, Ted, because what you're saying is there is something to be taught in this area.
Definitely. Our cooperation with God in working through things can make the difference between decades of bitterness or going through a hard time and then moving on.
And that's a tremendous amount of freedom to think about that, to reflect on my own life. Okay, what am I hurting with? And can I imagine that hurt not there?
Yeah, and you know what? There are many circumstances, a family that has an argument about a family business or a family farm, okay? An argument, a harsh word spoken between a father and a son. Even the disappointments that happen of wanting something to occur, maybe in your church, trying to help, maybe you're on a committee and you want something, you have good intentions, and then it's given a thumbs down, not a thumbs up. Those kind of things can easily be like a splinter under the skin that is infected, and even if it's there for a long time, it just kind of radiates pain.
I think the examples that you've given have resonated, right? It's like, oh, okay, I can see where hurt comes in. People are hurt from many reasons.
That's correct.
Right? We all have like a different threshold on what it means to be hurt. Let's talk about some of those ways that we're hurt.
Yeah. And so sometimes hurt comes because somebody has actually done something directly to you that has been hurtful. I mean, and that can be through harsh statements like, you'll never amount to anything. The flip side is hurt can come when somebody should do something and they don't. Like when somebody should say something kind or loving and they don't.
So we have what we might use the word offense, right? We can be offended against, and we need to perhaps define that term, what we mean by offense. But I'm saying offense being we have been sinned against, right?
That's right. And what we're talking about there is when somebody experiences injury because of somebody else's actions or inactions, which is different than when somebody has a different opinion than I do.
Some hurt comes just from disappointment.
It
right?
does.
I have an expectation for something, and I'm holding on to that expectation, and then there comes a point in time where I have to reconcile that that's not going to happen, and then what does that mean about me or my family or whatever, and we then walk through hurt that way.
Exactly. That can be loss of a job. It could be somebody's expecting to get a sale, and then that customer goes and buys something from the person down the road, and those kind of things cause hurt when that is personalized, okay? And then particularly when the motives for why it happened, that person didn't like me, they thought it was no good. Those kind of things go in as hurts and disappointments, and then they can revolve in somebody's mind for decades.
Well, see, here's what's interesting, Ted, is really what you are setting up here today in this discussion is, all right, there are tools to deal with that hurt. There is a proper way to take that hurt and process it, okay?
Yes.
Because I think one tendency, and there's maybe more, you can tell me, but there is a tendency that's kind of like, okay, I've been hurt, I just need to get over it and maybe not think about it or sweep it under the rug or stuff it or simply because I don't know what to do with it.
That's right.
And maybe it will go away by time or something like that, right?
Yes. And, you know, one of those very well-worn statements like time heals all wounds, you know, things like that, which, by the way, I have not found to be true.
Not true.
That time plus healing, time plus maturity and God's work, it can do a lot of things, but time
itself,
no.
All these tools that you're suggesting today work out itself in time.
Definitely.
But time is not the tool all by itself.
That's right.
I'm going to ask this question.
Okay.
Is it always necessary for me to approach that person and say, listen, I've been hurt? are they a part of the solution, or is this a prayer closet thing?
That's a great question, and the answer is sometimes either one or
Yeah.
both. So a couple things. In situations where you have the opportunity to work things through with another person, I think in an ideal world, if I hurt you and there was something there between us and you walked into my office and said, Ted, you know that conversation we had, that, I'm struggling with that. Can we talk through that? That would be great to be able to bring that full circle in there. Sometimes we have to go through the process of shedding and releasing the hurt when the other person doesn't either acknowledge it or doesn't want to own it, or, and I would say this is also a category too, is sometimes we have to release hurt for someone who is no longer in our lives, maybe when it has passed on.
Ted, what are some effects that hurt have on a person? What are some indicators?
Yes.
Because I'm gonna make this suggestion, Ted, is perhaps we don't even know when we're hurt. You know what I mean? I don't know when I have strep throat until the certain symptoms are there. And what are some of the symptoms that might indicate that you're hurt?
Yes. It is interesting because sometimes people can really identify the hurt and being able to say, oh, yes, I've been injured by this. Other times, there are things that cover that hurt, and one of the most common is anger. And because that anger rises up, and anger is an activating emotion that says, hey, that's wrong, and then we focus on the actions or lack of action of another person. What ends up happening there is our focus is on the person that we perceive has done us wrong, and in fact, that anger helps to cover up or shield us from the hurt that's underneath it. And so on accident, we can get so focused on the other person that we don't actually realize that we've sustained a wound.
We use anger as an outcome of hurt, but really it boxes that hurt in. It does not allow that wound to heal and get the correct ointment. Right?
Yes.
So we need to handle this concept of anger. So let's spend some time doing that. Walk us through anger. Is anger always wrong? Start at the 101 here.
Yeah. So first of all, anger is an emotion, a human emotion, but it also is something that reflects the nature and character of God. The interesting thing is God always handles it well, and always does it perfectly. But as human beings, it's important to note that anger itself, when the Bible says, be angry and sin not in Ephesians, it's highlighting that there's a way to have an emotion, but there's also what you do as the natural outgrowth or the expression of that emotion. Some people suppress anger and they hold it inside and bottle it up, and that may actually look a little bit more Christian.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, bottling that up can also lead to bitterness, and which isn't at all Christian, you know. The other side is being rightly angry about something, but then turning around and acting in a way that isn't healthy or godly. That's wrong. So what we're talking about here is being able to understand that the emotion of anger is one thing. What we do with it is another. Anger also, we often refer to as a secondary emotion, meaning that something else starts it off. Feeling disregarded or unlistened to or hurt, embarrassed, whatever, forgotten. Frustration. I'm not able to get through something and something doesn't turn out the way I want. Frustration. Fear. Fear is an activator for anger. Physical pain. And then the last one being righteous indignation.
The challenge of anger is to be angry at the right time, at the right magnitude.
Exactly.
That's what Jesus did.
That's exactly right.
And then carrying that out
And
in the
carrying
right
it
manner.
out.
So let's go back to, we've got a hurt, and that hurt, we are resorting to anger. Walk us through the releasing of that anger.
Yeah. So one of the first things that happens after we're hurt and we have anger is we tend to ruminate, or that means to play the scene over and over and over in our heads. And that's very normal, natural, that when we have a shock to our system, we play it over. Unfortunately, one of the things that happens is that over time, the more that we play it over and we have those conversations in our head with that person, or we think of that thing we wish we would have said or what we'd like to say, those kind of things, unfortunately, we can actually over time ramp up our anger and solidify the hurt and solidify the us versus them.
So is the first one just having this awareness that saying,
Yes.
oh, hey, this is what I'm doing, and this is going to lead me down a trail that's not helpful to my hurt.
I'm playing this scene out. I've been hurt. And to understand that there's healthier and unhealthier ways to deal with it. The fact that your mind's trying to process it and plays it over, that's part of being human. But being able to say, okay, now wait a minute. I have some options here, and one of those is going to take me down the route of bitterness. Okay? The other is to be able to go, okay, I've been hurt. I'm playing this over. I need to do something with this hurt that's actually going to move me forward instead of a loop.
So we've identified then that this rumination's going on, saying, okay, this is an earmark of anger here, and this is not helpful, so I stop that. Now what? What's kind of...
So a couple things. I think it's really important to then identify what actually was the source of the hurt and what was I feeling. So if the frustration or the emotional hurt is the source, that's what we have to deal with. So let's say that this is somebody who was expecting somebody to follow through on a promise to them, and that promise was broken, and it adds injury because the trust was broken and they felt forgotten in some way. To be able to feel that, to be able to know that's what it was, and then to be able to start saying, I need to allow myself to feel sad, I need to allow myself to understand the injury, but then I don't want this to be attached to me, okay? I'm going to want to shed this. And then the ways we shed, oftentimes, particularly if it's a hurt that someone else did, is to move toward forgiveness. And forgiveness, then, is a releasing process whereby we release the debt that somebody else essentially owes us emotionally.
So if I understand it, you kind of illustrated 3 steps then, this concept of a wherewithal that, I'm angry, I'm ruminating, I'm playing this thing out. That's not helpful. Number 2, thinking, okay, what is it that I'm hurtful about?
Yes.
Really looking at the hurt and not that outer shell that's making us kind of cradle the hurt, but getting down to the hurt. And number 3, forgiveness. But let's go back and say a bit more about number 2, getting down to the hurt and looking at the hurt. I would imagine that is a pretty tender moment, right?
It is.
I mean, to kind of go back down into that grief a little bit and be honest about what was real and what's not real.
That's right. And sometimes that takes a little time of reflection. Okay, sometimes that takes seeking some counsel to help us through that, a wise mentor or friend. And also to understand personality-wise, some people by their nature, when there's a hurt, they feel it really intensely. They tend to be verbal. They tend to experience things really, really intensely. Other people stuff and hold things in and box things up. And you do have to kind of know yourself related to this, because if somebody is hurt and they tend towards hurt easily and they tend towards kind of spewing hurt, okay, they have to work on tamping that down and bringing that in so it can be redeemed. And somebody else who kind of suppresses and holds it in and doesn't want to deal with it and just wants to avoid it, they have to kind of work at bringing it forward.
I'm thinking about you working with people going through this. Is it important that there's kind of a time and place that you do this and then you move on because you've done it? Does that make sense?
Yes, great question. Remember, time doesn't heal all wounds. Therefore, it is important to enter a forgiveness process. Now, that's going to differ based on the type of wound it is, what kind of thing it is. If the hurt is an ongoing kind of a thing, or if it's something that happened years ago, there's differences there. But I like to tell people that forgiveness is both a process and a decision. And I think it's really important that we choose to enter the forgiveness process so that we can actually go through in a stepwise fashion and actually move forward.
I get a sense sometimes that angry people don't know how to live life without the anger. Okay, now let me say a little bit more, and then I want you to respond to it.
Okay.
They've made such a meal of the anger, such a meal of the bitterness, that it's become their pastime thoughts. And in a way, and in a sense, that's the life they know, and it's the life they like.
Yeah.
And to say, I need to get out from under this anger means that I resign, and then I have a life less on the other side of it.
Unhealed anger, as it goes into bitterness, affects us physically, emotionally, relationally, and spiritually. All those areas. Physically, it is known that angry people, that pent-upness affects the body.
It's stressful.
It's stressful. It affects the heart. It affects the hormone levels. It affects sleep. All those different kind of things. Emotionally, the Bible teaches us things about what to think on. Okay? The things that are true and honest and lovely and of good report. And you'll notice that ruminating on past hurts isn't in Philippians 4:8.
Right.
Okay? And there's a reason, because it tanks our mood and it prevents us from seeing the opportunities and blessings around us. Now, that's not to minimize hurt. Believe me, I'm not about minimizing hurt. Jesus didn't minimize hurt. He paid on the cross for all the hurt. So he doesn't minimize it. Relationally, anger and bitterness is alienating. It makes us versus them a way of life.
And it can be a generational torrent, can't it?
No question.
You don't have to look any further than the Middle East
For sure.
to see what anger passed down generationally looks
No
like.
question. There's lots of theological reasons why the Middle East isn't solved, but part of the reason why it isn't is because everybody there lives by an eye for an eye and tooth for tooth. The concept of grace and forgiveness is not in their worldview. And then spiritually, for us to hold on to bitterness and to look at another person and have that angst towards them, the Bible talks about the parable of the unjust steward, in which he was forgiven and then he turned around and then he didn't forgive somebody else. And there is a huge teaching there. For us to say, Jesus, forgive me of my sin, I need you to be my Savior, and then for us to turn around and say, that person there will not be forgiven by me, that's an affront to Jesus Christ.
Yeah. So, Ted, this has been very helpful, and we're going to close this episode, and I want you to close by just answering this simple question, but I think it's an important question. And the question is this: is life on the other side of anger better? And now, I'm not saying better like, yeah, I know I should be that way. Yeah, I know that's what Jesus wants. What I mean by better is the quality is better.
Oh, my word. I would say, very simply, and I forget who said this, maybe you know, but forgiveness and releasing that anger is setting a prisoner free and finding out that it was us. And it is a powerful thing to be able to let those weights and let the past be the past, and we can really live in God's grace in the present, emotionally free, relationally free, spiritually free, and that is so worth it. In essence, the radiation that leaks out of bitterness has no end, but the joy of a person who knows grace and forgiveness also radiates out too.
And with that, I think to our listeners, you can get a sense of why this message is on the top of Ted's list of things to get out, right?
Yep.
Because we're all dealing with this hurt. And because of it, our lives, in all of those areas that you mentioned, relationally, physically, but most importantly, spiritually, are hindered. And there's much to release of this anger. Thank you for that, Ted. And we're going to pick up in the next episode, Ted, and talk a little bit more about forgiveness. There's a lot to say about forgiveness. It's not an easy topic.
Nope.
So we're going to devote one of the episodes to that. So thanks for being with us today. We pray that this has been helpful.